Caesarea Maritima, or Caesarea by the Sea, was the Roman capital of Judea, the political capital. It was located west of Jerusalem on the Mediterranean Sea, and it was an important port town and a strategic place for the empire. Pontius Pilate resided there and ruled from there. Jerusalem may have been the spiritual capital of Judea, but Caesarea Maritima was the political center of the occupying empire. During times of major festivals and large gatherings in Jerusalem, when Jerusalem would be packed with crowds of people from all over the countryside, Pilate would travel with his armies and legions to the holy city to make sure that nothing out of the ordinary occurred and that no uprising or civil unrest occurred. So there were actually two processions into Jerusalem. Pilate traveled and entered Jerusalem from the west with the full weight and support of the empire with him. You can imagine the mass of soldiers marching to Jerusalem, armed and ready to maintain control and stability. Pilate came to Jerusalem to display the empire's power, to remind the people who they served. It was a display of the power of subjection, the power of force, the power of death. Around the same time Pilate entered from the west, Jesus rode into Jerusalem from the east. Down from the Mount of Olives and out from Bethany, he traveled the way of the Messiah told by the prophets. Something I would like us to consider is that everything Jesus did in his final days, the final days of his life, everything was extremely intentional and focused. Jesus' procession into Jerusalem was kind of like a counter procession, a kind of challenge to the empire. The crowds that gathered around him in the days before the Passover may have included some of the same people that he fed, maybe even the same people he healed, maybe the sick he cured, and maybe even the dead he raised. Simple people who were finally seen and heard and nourished and given hope. They all gathered to surround Jesus as he entered the city from the east, belting out their hosannas, hoping he would save them. All the while, Pilate was entering the same city from the west, ready to crush anything that challenged Roman authority. While Pilate's procession highlighted power and violence and the forces of death, Jesus' procession is the beginning of the culmination of all the ways he has reminded and will remind God's people of the depths and extent of God's love. In this setting, as these two processions draw nearer and nearer, one from the west and one from the east, we know that there is bound to be a collision between the forces of the empire, the forces of death, and the one who came to give life to the world. It's a collision between an imperial system of oppression legitimated in the name of God and the one who came to remind the people of God's true and everlasting reign of love by healing and feeding, by nourishing and giving life to the dead, and by challenging the institutions and the puppet priests that colluded with the forces of the empire to control the people in the name of God. 2,000 years later, the competition between the forces of death and violence and the promise of life in the beloved community of God, that competition remains with us. This is our story. And I would say that these competitions even remain within ourselves. The struggle between the forces of death and violence and the forces of love and life, they compete within our hearts and minds, our bodies and spirits. And so it's no wonder that we see the same competitions happening in the other bodies that we inhabit. the social bodies and political bodies and the other circles that we are a part of. We see the same competition play out over and over every day of our lives within us and around us. The choice between death and life. The choice between following in the footsteps of Jesus or worshiping the idols of the empire. As our Holy Week opens, I invite you, friends, to meet Jesus on the journey that he will take over the course of this week. From excitement and hope-filled hosannas of this day to the cross and beyond it. Come Thursday and find yourself at table with him and his friends. Join to break the same bread and drink from the same cup. Kneel with Jesus to wash the feet of your friends, even as Jesus knelt to wash the feet of his betrayer. Sit and accept the grace and generosity of your feet being washed. Stand with Jesus in his confrontation with the authorities on Friday. Feel the weight of the accusations and hear the crowd of people deceived as they demand Jesus' crucifixion. Walk with Jesus on the way of the cross. Stay with women at the foot of the cross as he dies, and feel their heartbreak as everyone else walks away. Endure the waiting of Saturday and be aware of the broken dreams and evaporated hopes of his disciples and the grief of his mother and friends. All before coming back on Sunday to be reminded that this is not the end. All before regathering and remembering that in God's story and in God's dream for God's creation, the forces of death will not have the last word. Just as Jesus in his last days was intentional about everything he did, even about the way he entered Jerusalem, I invite you to enter this Holy Week with intention. Enter this Holy Week with intention and walk with your friends and loved ones this week as if this week is our pilgrimage. It's a pilgrimage we make each Holy Week and not simply a commemoration of historic events. We participate in this pilgrimage because the journey of these days is our journey too. The readings today may end with death, but our walk with Jesus this week and in all our weeks is all about remembering that in the competition between the forces of this world, the forces of death and violence, in that competition where they compete against the forces of life and love that God unleashes, death never has the last word. And yet, as we're reminded in baptism, this week also reminds us that a part of us dies as we seek more and more to follow in the ways of Jesus and enjoy God's promises of abundance and everlasting life. Amen.